So, hello everyone. My name is Josh Brown from the DSA International Committee's Climate and Economic Subcommittee. I'd like to thank everybody for attending this, which is our third session of the Intro to Global Economics series. Every month, we're exploring a different actor or dynamic in the global economy, from the rules of trade to the dollar system, from the WTO to debt, and trying to demystify the rules of the neocolonial, neoliberal world system to better struggle for a just alternatives. And this month, we're looking at two of the most fundamental institutions in the global economy, which are the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Now, for most of us on the left, we realize that these names are at least, signal something that's somewhat bad, right? But generally, that's where the understanding tends to end. So what we want to try and understand better with this session is what exactly are these institutions? Why were they created? How do they operate? And what role have they played in shaping the world that we exist in today? And most of all, how can we on the US left join in solidarity with people around the world, be it Argentina, Kenya, or Lebanon, to build a better alternative for the global economy and build a global system that works better for everyone? So to help us answer these questions and more today, we have a truly special group of speakers. The first of which is Dr. Jayati Ghosh. She is a professor of economics at UMass Amherst, a member of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, the author or editor of over 20 different books, and so much more that we would be here all day listing it all. And Bhumika Muchhala is a political economist and senior advisor with the Third World Network, and is campaigning, advocating, and writing on economic justice and international financial architecture, economic policy sovereignty, feminist political economy, and critical thinking on the global Green New Deal. She's a PhD candidate and part-time faculty at the New School on political economy and climate justice, and is working on a possible integration of the dependency theory and neocolonial theory in the context of debt and austerity in the global South. She's of Indian origin, grew up in Jakarta, and is now based in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm also very sorry to add that Jason Berganza of Aphrodad, who was advertised as a participant, will not be able to join us today due to an urgent personal matter. I know that Jason's going to be missed, and all of us are wishing him and his family the best. So moving on, each of these speakers that I've listed will first share their prepared opening remarks, and these remarks will then be followed by a Q&A session. And if you have a question at any time, just feel free to share it in the Q&A box, but not the chat box, just to keep things more organized. You can, however, use the chat box just to introduce yourselves and share where you're from or what you might be interested in, so we get to know each other a little bit more. The session will be recorded, and it'll be posted on the International Committee's YouTube page and shared with all the registrants in the coming days, so do be on the lookout for that. So with all that housekeeping out of the way, and without further ado, the World Bank and IMF. What are they? Dr. Ghosh, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Josh, and it's a pleasure to be back with the DSA group on economics. Yeah, let me just begin by talking about why they were set up in the first place. So, when you think about it, these Bretton Woods institutions, what's odd about them, in the US at least, is that they come under attack from the left, of course, but also from the right. Republican senators are like, going hammer and tongs at the World Bank and the IMF, which is a bit weird if you think of them as agents of US imperialism. So clearly the issue is more complicated. And so what exactly is it? When you, during the Second World War, when basically the world was in a mess and there was finally, some realization that you have to do things in a more structured way globally, even to keep capitalism going. There was a lot of activity about setting in place a structure that would do two very, very important things. One was a global lender of last resort. Okay, it's a bit like a central bank within a country, but it's a global sort of central bank or institution that will do the functions of lender of last resort, that will do what central banks do to maintain stability in the system. So in other words, we needed something that would enable financial stability in the whole world across different countries and currencies, because otherwise what you got was this chaotic situation of the interwar period where, that you had very rapid currency movements in all sides and very volatile capital flows and periodic crises. Of course, the big global depression was the biggest of these crises. If this sounds familiar, it's because we're in a kind of similar situation now. But that was the first recognition that we need stabilization. And the second recognition was that we need development finance. We need public finance that will support development and, of course, reconstruction after the Second World War. In fact, the World Bank was first called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. No surprises, reconstruction meant Europe, which was seen to be the most devastated. And of course, it's because of the broadly, shall we say, neo-colonial orientation of the institutions that Europe was the focus of the reconstruction, but also development. You need to provide finance that the market won't do, the private sector will not do, in infrastructure, in social spending, in a whole range of other areas where you're not going to get that investment otherwise. So the purpose, when you think about it, it was very important, very necessary, and it's something that still exists. We still need that global stabilization situation. We need a lender of last resort. We need some institution that will do discounting in a crisis, that will, like the US Federal Reserve does when there's a financial crisis domestically, that will provide counter-cyclical lending, that will enable, distressed exports of countries that are repaying their debt to find markets. We need an institution like that. And we do need development finance. There's no getting away from it. So what happened to make the IMF and the World Bank so problematic in their implications for especially the developing world? But I would argue for more than the developing world. Well, really, it is two things. One is the way that they were structured, which very much reflected, if you like, not just the economic, but the political victories of the Second World War. I mean, the US got dominant say in both institutions, 26% of the voting rights, which also translates into what are called quotas in the IMF. Quotas means how much you can draw out of the IMF for your own purposes. Europe, again, got a disproportionate share in voting rights and quotas. And essentially, Western Europe, I should say, essentially the structure of the IMF reflected this power balance that had emerged after the Second World War. And particularly, if you like, the global West, the North and West, if you like, got disproportionate power in these institutions. There was a gentleman's agreement, I'm using the term gentleman within inverted commas, that the head of the IMF will always come from Europe, the head of the World Bank will always come from the US. Why? And who are the gentlemen? But that's how it is. And you will notice that that continues till this day. And essentially, because of the structure of voting rights and quotas and all that, the US is in pretty much a position to determine whatever it wants for these institutions to do. And Europe, the Western European countries that have significant power within these institutions also pretty much go along with that. Now, despite that, the US from the beginning kind of undermined these. US globally has always been unilateral. So they never really like institutions that appear multilateral, and they kind of try to undermine them often indirectly, unless they play completely according to the rules that they set. And so the US, with its Marshall Plan, with its other kinds of spending, tried to provide much more resources than were available to the IMF for the whole world, to a few countries in Europe, for example. But more than that, over time, US and mainstream economists set the rules of both institutions in ways that I would argue were really against the broader spirit of those agreements. If you read the IMF Articles of Agreement or the World Bank's Articles of Agreement, they suggest a very different framework from the one that we now associate with these Bretton Woods institutions. They call Bretton Woods institutions because they were set up in a conference in a hotel in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. Broadly speaking, there are two problems. One is, of course, the voting rights and structure and things that I've already mentioned. But the other is the conditionalities that are associated with IMF and World Bank lending. So the IMF is supposed to provide finance for countries in crisis, in distress, in balance of payments difficulties. So, and it's supposed to, it typically will provide up to your quota in the IMF, which is determined or was determined supposedly by a formula based on your share in the world economy and world trade. But it's archaic. It's an old formula, and it's not been revised upwards for quite a long time now. But for each of these loans, progressively, the more you ask for, you will have to meet with conditions. And these conditions have increasingly followed what has become codified as what's called the Washington Consensus, okay? And the original Washington Consensus, they were basically, I mean, it's what we would today call, the LPG package, liberalization, privatization, globalization, but it meant fiscal discipline is what they call it, but it means austerity. It means cutting down spending. It means shifting from subsidies, which they saw as bad, to other kinds of spending. All subsidies are bad, even when they affect the poor, even when they are, when tax breaks are equivalent, but tax breaks to corporates are never seen as a problem. Tax reform means what? Means reduce direct taxes, increase indirect taxes, go to something like GST, goods and services taxes and indirect taxes and VATs. Determine financial liberalization in terms of not having interest rate caps. So letting the market determine interest rates. They call it competitive exchange rates, but it basically means devalue the exchange rate. If you're a country in crisis, devalue, and don't allow multiple exchange rates. That is, don't use industrial policy to give certain sectors any beneficial rates. Liberalize trade, liberalize the rules of foreign direct investment, privatize state-owned enterprises, because why? Public sector is always more inefficient than the private sector. Deregulate industries, because that's going to encourage investment, it's going to raise animal spirits, and recognize property rights. These are, if you like, the 10 pillars of what has been called the first Washington Consensus. And then you got, it's been called now the Augmented Washington Consensus, because, every time they went and did this, countries ended up in a worse soup. The list of countries that have not benefited from doing these policies in crisis and have ended up going back for more money, I cannot tell you how long that is. But just to give you an example, there are two countries in Asia, Philippines and Pakistan, which have been on IMF programs now for almost uninterrupted for about 45 years. And each time they're doing exactly what the IMF tells them, but then it gets worse. And then the IMF says, no, you didn't do it exactly right. You have to make the following changes and so on, okay? So because it was not working in so many cases, they said, well, we forgot a few other things. So we're adding these, augmented, okay? What are those? We have to look at corporate governance. What's the problem? All these developing countries, everyone's corrupt. And so, even these corporations, they don't really have proper governance, not like us northerners who know how to do things. Anti-corruption, again, the problem is not us, the problem is not our policies, it's all these corrupt governments in the developing world. As if, of course, there's no corruption in the north. Flexible labor markets. It turns out we didn't deregulate enough. You have to also deny labor its rights. You have to bring in flexibility, because that's what's holding up employment generation. Of course, by then the WTO had come into being, so you have to do everything in conformity with the WTO agreements, which is further liberalization, privatization, and globalization, if you like. Financial liberalization now has to incorporate bringing in the codes and standards of the Anglo-Saxon world, that is England and US, which is the most liberal and the most, if you like, pro-market, pro-investor, pro-capital system of codes and standards. Open up your capital accounts. Of course, do it prudently, they say, but basically all kinds of countries, Nepal, Botswana, countries that really don't have developed financial sectors are being told to open up the capital account and allow volatile capital flows of all kinds. When you choose an exchange rate regime, make it either completely fixed or completely flexible. Don't opt for a managed exchange rate. Now that's bizarre, because all these developed countries are doing managed exchange rates themselves, but that was the advice. Independent central banks, you've all heard that term. As if, in fact, central banks can never really be independent. But what's the idea here? That they should focus only on inflation targeting. And in developing countries, that means whenever there's the slightest increase in inflation, raise your interest rates. well, you can see what's happening to that in the US right now, but it's very rare in the US for that to happen. The US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve has been much more careful about employment being a major goal as well. Then they said to keep everybody happy, oh, we also believe in social safety nets, we believe in poverty reduction, but hey, targeted poverty reduction, not universal programs. Don't provide universal anything, target everything, identify them, and then put conditions on them, make them work for it. If you're going to give a transfer, make them prove that they're going to do something good in return from getting some money. So targeted, which gives you all these errors of exclusion and unwarranted inclusion, but nonetheless, it means less money for poverty reduction and safety nets. Okay, so bad news. They're doing all this bad stuff. Why do we still need these? Because, unfortunately, the reason they were set up, let's face it, is ultimately to do with global public goods, or today we would call them global public bads, the stuff that happens because there's a global commons, but there's nobody to handle it. And there are all these national interests and capital interests that make things go the wrong way, whether it is environment, the climate change, the pandemic, you name it, right? So we need a stabilization element, we need a development and global public good financing element. We have to have them. And it's going to take too long to create new institutions. Our problems are too urgent. What we really need to do is to reform these institutions. Reform is too mild a word for what I want. I want a massive, massive reorientation of these institutions in terms of the structure, the voting rights, the composition, but also in terms of the conditionalities. Don't base the conditionalities on these, which we know do not work. Put climate conditions, put sustainable development indicator conditions, put are you spending the money for the people kinds of conditions. And we can work them out. People have done that. We've all worked out different kinds of conditionalities that can be imposed. That's really what we need to do. We need to completely transform these institutions so that they fulfill in the 21st century the job they were meant to do way back, which is to deal with these global problems in a way that you cannot deal with nationally. Okay, let me stop here. I'm sure Bhumika will have much more to add.
Thanks, Joan, so much, Jayati, for providing that really comprehensive overview of the Bretton Woods institutions and doing it so smoothly and in such a way that was very easy to interpret for everyone. So, Bhumika, I don't want to take all the air out of the room, so I can go ahead and pass the mic over to you if you're ready.
Hello, hi, greetings. It's really an absolute honor to be here today with the DSA. This is just a fantastic teach-in and webinar series, and I've been watching the other ones as well with many great voices and perspectives. It's been a really great initiative, so thank you for this project. So yes, thank you. Thank you for that as well. Yes, so that was such a stellar, brilliant introduction by Jayati, and it's always so very challenging to follow on her heels, but I will try to just pick apart and develop some of the points that Jayati made. So you got a good sort of overview of how the IMF was created, what its role is, what are some of its policy paradigms and policy agendas. So I'll just take it from there and maybe reinforce a few points. So a first point to reinforce is that, the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, the reason why it cemented US economic hegemony in that World War II context of a rapidly transforming global economic order is precisely because the gold standard was replaced by the US dollar as the global reserve currency or the global trade payments currency to use for all trade transactions, to use for all economic transactions. And this is a big deal. This is, also in the context of the US having the largest amount of gold reserves, in large part because the United States was not impacted by World War II to the same degree that Europe was. So where Europe was impacted, financially, it was absolutely slammed by World War II. The US was in a position to come in as a benefactor and take over the helm of the UK and Germany as sort of the global economic center. And when the IMF was originally created to be a kind of global central bank, it was primarily the US that decided against giving the IMF the power of that kind of global central bank coordination, and instead agreed to contribute to a different kind of system of a fixed pool of national currencies and gold to be held by the IMF based on the weighted economic power of each member country, being entitled to borrow what it needed within the limits of its contributions. So what you saw was an alignment to economic power cemented into the governance of the IMF. Meanwhile, the World Bank, just to add in, despite its name, was not the World Central Bank. At the time of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the World Bank was set up to lend to the European countries, the Marshall Plan, devastated by World War II. And then this purpose of the World Bank post-World War II transformed to lending money to economic development, primarily infrastructure and telecommunications projects in developing countries. At that time, many of which were still under colonial rule and anti-colonial movements in 1944, but this also quickly morphed over the many decades, where what we see today, the World Bank is very much spearheading deregulation schemes and all kinds of conditional policy loans, and especially the kind of, hydroelectric dams and big, massive infrastructure projects, which over the decades have been massively controversial. So the key point is that neither the IMF nor the World Bank was actually empowered or mandated to provide long-term loans to countries facing chronic balance of payments problems and rising international debts. And this is critical to understanding how the IMF morphed from an international monetary coordination agency into a de facto lender of last resort for global South borrowers in debt distress. It is this shift that facilitates the state finance nexus and the conferring of structural power from the state to private and institutional creditors and lenders. It provides the IMF this role of fiscal disciplinarian or fiscal enforcer of borrowing countries in exchange for emergency financing and loans. And this has de facto turned into an unparalleled power to shape the economic policies and systems of global South nations, to shape the paradigm in ways that generate debt dependency and systemic inequalities on multiple scales. And I'll go into this just next. On IMF governance, I think Jayati covered it all. I think the key point I would add is that the executive directors on the IMF's board are appointed. They're not elected, they're appointed. They're conferred by the country's finance ministries. And this creates a huge accountability gap. The US has effective veto power in that there is no approval that the IMF can take without the approval of the US. And this is precisely why the House Financial Services Committee in Congress is so critical. The advocacy that has been going on for years through congressional briefings and through working with members of the House Financial Services Committee is critical. During the 2007 and 8 global financial crisis, many of us worked very closely with Barney Frank. And that kind of advocacy within Congress also then pushed Congress to approve the issuance of SDRs, or special drawing rights, a kind of money creation that the IMF can do, both during the global financial crisis and recently last year in 2021 in August. But I just want to highlight the kind of economic apartheid that really does operate at the heart of the IMF. So if we look at OECD-rich countries or the G8 countries, they control over half of the vote in the IMF. 85% of the world's population in the global South has a minority share. So we break that down just in terms of, a rough calculation. An average person in the global North has 1 vote. An average person in the global South has 1/8 of a vote. So this is an entrenched racialized inequality. It's a good demonstration of how economic apartheid works. Now, there have been so many efforts over the decades to reform this deeply unequal governance structure. One of the key calls from global justice movements and campaigns that I've worked with, and many of us have worked with, is the call for a double majority system at both the level of the IMF Board of Governors and the Executive Board. What does that mean? It means that decisions would require a double majority, the majority of IMF members and a majority of their voting weight. So this would give some weight, this would give some importance to the number of IMF members toward the majority of IMF members, 85% global south. So I'll just shift into the next slide, and there was an overview of the various kinds of conditions, but I'll just go through some of the conditions that we've been seeing recently in the last decade. So one of the key points is that over the last 40 years, every economic and or financial crisis, 1980s debt crisis and the structural adjustment programs generating a lost decade across Latin America and Africa, Asian financial crisis of 1997 and 98, various crises in the early 2000s, global financial crisis in 2007 and 8, and now COVID, and currently the context of the current food price inflation shock really hitting the global south. So we see recurrent boom, bust, financial and economic crises, different exogenous factors, different contexts. But the key thing we see is a spike in debt levels and a consistent sort of folding into the IMF for taking out emergency financing loans on a repeated basis. So just a quick overview. Researchers Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummins looked at 779 IMF country reports between 2010 and 2018. And this is before COVID. Things have amplified and reproduced. As we all know, neoliberalism has effectively reproduced itself through the COVID crisis. So these are just some of the overview. Many of these have just been mentioned. I'll highlight that, the public expenditure reductions in public services, this is what exacerbated COVID. A big part of the inadequacy or the failure of public health systems has been the systematic erosion of public systems, the war against the public, right? And in developing countries, especially, opening the gateway for privatization and foreign ownership. Another key one to highlight is the public wage bill cuts, caps, and freezes, and why this impacts the global south so disproportionately, primarily because the vast majority of teachers, doctors, and nurses, many of whom are disproportionately young women, are public employees, not private. They're public employees. You hit the public wage bill, a lot of times this is targeted to civil servants or government employees that are taking up too much flack in the government budget. But this really hits the efficacy, the resilience of public systems. Reduced pensions and social security benefits, lowered subsidies, including for food, fertilizers, and fuel. Now, this is a key trigger for social unrest across the world. Today, Sri Lanka, Ecuador, Lebanon, almost so many places around the world across different continents, but historically as well, Arab uprising, it was very much related to this spike in the price of living, the cost, the inability to survive. Social protection programs. The IMF is notorious, especially since the global financial crisis, for implementing social safety nets. While social safety nets sounds great, it evades universal social protection systems. So instead of financing a universal system that can cover social protection for all who need it, there is this narrow, temporary, targeted cash transfer scheme, Band-Aid approaches that often exclude the majority of low-income communities, that often through the bureaucracy miss transfer to the people who need it the most. Regressive taxation was mentioned, value added and sales taxes. The antidote is what? The antidote is progressive taxation on income and on wealth. And yes, in many developing countries, income taxation is very difficult, and that is why addressing corporate tax evasion, or what is in jargon known as illicit financial flows, the extremely complex and legalized architecture globally for facilitating transnational corporate tax evasion and avoidance into tax havens, which we have been hearing so much about through all of the all of the different files that have been released and all the investigative journalism that is revealing so much detail on tax havens. Of course, worker precarity, minimum wage reductions, erosions of trade union protections, trade union strength, collective bargaining rights is at the center of many of these fiscal austerity conditions, fiscal austerity paradigms. Why? Because what we're seeing right now in a country like Ecuador is the public health sector has very weak trade union strength. It's not as unionized as the education sector. And so a lot of the public budget cuts mandated by the IMF, the government is imposing those cuts on the public health system, even during a global pandemic. Meanwhile, the education sector is not seeing the same degree or scale of budget cuts. And it's interesting to note, it's because of the strength of union organizing. It's worker organizing that is making that difference. I haven't included monetary policy conditionalities, but this is enormous. As was mentioned, central bank independence, interest rate increases that dampen the economy. It's really a key issue that right now there's so much interest rate increases happening across developing countries to counter the food price inflation. But the food price inflation is not due to increased demand, it's due to the cost side of things, the supply side of things, not the demand side. So economies are being depressed and repressed for the wrong reasons. It is the wrong solution to the food price inflation. So I mentioned that during COVID, these loans have just skyrocketed. August 2021, academics Kanteklinis and Stubbs wrote that 221 loans with 88 developing countries. So that gives you a sense of the kind of the ways in which the IMF is very much back in business. Austerity measures will impact 85% of the world's population in 2022, 80% of whom are in the global south. So we see this era of austerity today, very similar to the 1980s. The UN, even the World Bank are saying more than 100 million people will be pushed into poverty over the last couple of years, and that another lost decade for the global south is imminent. UNCTAD has been saying this repeatedly, for example. Inequalities on the registers of gender, race, sexuality, ability, ethnicity, caste, citizenship, refugees, all of this are compounded. This is an intersectional dilemma. This is not simply economic. This is intersectional inequality and political. And I just want to mention that, the empirical data-based evidence across time, across geography, demonstrates that austerity doesn't restore economies, doesn't generate productive investments, doesn't reduce unemployment. Academic research has shown repeatedly correlations between increases in inequality and the presence of an IMF loan program. It's also gendered. Low-income women, poor women are the shock absorbers of austerity. They carry out additional care, health, educational labor to compensate for public budget cuts, and they take on more work in informal markets. So we have we have heaps of impact analysis literature that shows the damage that austerity wreaks and the way in which it plunges countries that are already in economic downturns into further recessions, into further downturns, deepening the inequalities, and the economic downturn. So it's no surprise that mass protests and counter movements have surged across the globe over the course of decades. Military regimes have fallen. All kinds of movements have surged, decrying austerity's devastating toll, castigating it for deepening social injustices and indignities. In Ecuador today, I just want to highlight one key thing that relates to climate change. There are a slew of fiscal consolidation, fiscal austerity measures, both monetary, regressive taxation, central bank independence, public expenditure cuts. What's really interesting, there's a footnote in their 2021, September 2021 country report. And it was fascinating to find this footnote. It says that the domestic savings generated, or the fiscal surplus generated from the measures that have been recommended, cannot be used for public investments in climate change. And this points to the key issue of not only does austerity, reduce the financing for climate change, but in fact, even within the IMF documents, there is a discouragement or a barring or a sanctioning of using the money generated from austerity for climate change. So, this is a key point where climate change and austerity really impact each other. And I'll conclude with the structural power. Why is this happening? What is really behind, what is the politics behind this devastating austerity paradigm? Well, one, IMF loans are a precondition for the restructuring of sovereign debt. So if, countries want to keep maintaining lines of commercial credit, maintain their access to external finance, meaning foreign exchange, that is generated through international sovereign bond markets, loans, credit lines. National economic policies then require the external approval of the IMF. The external approval of the IMF determines the ratings given by credit rating agencies. Credit rating agencies shape investor, creditor, and lender decisions. And all of this is a very simplified sketch, but this entire constellation affects access to finance, not just access to finance, but investment flows and even trade relations. So if we look at the central feature of neoliberalism as the distortion of the role of the state to serve the interests and priorities of the market through the state apparatus at the expense of the public, this fiscal disciplinarian role of the IMF can then be viewed more clearly as a handmaiden of the financial and private sector. The reality of centuries of colonialism followed by economic imperialism means that most global South nations cannot risk being cut off from access to external financing. They can't risk not being able to access foreign exchange, not just to pay for imports, but for running, for the survival, for the maintenance of their economies. They also can't risk capital outflows, especially when capital controls are not sanctioned. They can't risk worsening their terms of borrowing or credit rating downgrades. So this requires that state administrators, and this is, I'm quoting verbatim, an IMF staff person in a consultation meeting, quote unquote, keep their creditors happy and not scare away potential investors. So keep their creditors happy and not scare away potential investors sums up the structural power of finance, where social and economic rights, economic recovery, health recovery is superseded by this imperative. So in the context of this power asymmetry between the global South and the financial hegemony, this is where we see really the role of the IMF. The fund's chief economist, he said himself in a 2016 paper, famously titled "Neoliberalism Oversold." And he writes, "It is surely the case that many countries have little choice but to engage in fiscal consolidation because markets will not allow them to continue borrowing." So there it is, right from the horse's mouth. And I end with reforms that have been pursued by campaigners, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bhumika, for providing that much more granular analysis of all these Bretton Woods institutions and the consequences of the, in many cases, obligatory implementation of those policies across the global South. It's very comprehensive. So now, as I mentioned, I'd like us to go ahead and move on to our Q&A. We're just going to use the remainder of the time we had to tease out some of these points that we've covered in a bit greater detail. And as a reminder to the audience, do feel free to share any questions that you might have in the Q&A box. We might not get to every one of them, but we'll do our best to provide an answer and be as concise and comprehensive as we possibly can. To the panelists, unless otherwise noted, these questions are just to the panel at large, so you can feel free to jump in and answer questions however you like. So I do see that we have a couple in the box. And the first one I see is, would one or both of the panelists address the significance of the crisis of the Bretton Woods system, which occurred circa 1970, when, among other things, President Richard Nixon in the US took the dollar off the gold standard and sort of broke that connection? Oh, Jayati, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was muted. Let me just briefly take that up. So the Bretton Woods system is slightly different from the Bretton Woods institution. When people talk about that, they're talking about that period when the US dollar was linked to gold. So it was like a US dollar gold standard. The dollar was supposed to be, it was basically $35 to an ounce was the supposedly fixed value of the US dollar to gold. And then everybody traded in dollars and used dollars. It ended famously in June 1971 when Nixon announced that basically we're not going to give you $35 per ounce anymore. It's up for grabs. We'll let the market decide how much. And that led to the end of what is called the Bretton Woods system. It didn't mean the end of US dollar hegemony. And that's quite interesting because it tells us something very important about the nature of money. Charles Kindleberger said it very well. He was an international economist. He said money is about power. International money is about international power. And the US hegemony has sort of sustained through very many phases when it seemed like it might come down in the 1970s, then again, just before Clinton in the late 1980s and so on, sustained essentially because the US has shown itself to be willing to do whatever it takes to control global resources. So you could put, for example, the various wars in the Middle East, various other things. It's not defender of free world, it is controller of global resources, which has given US this inordinate power, which in turn means that the US and the US dollar still remain the most important and potent monetary force in the world. And which then means that these other institutions and the liquidity they create, like the SDRs that the IMF creates, the special drawing rights that the IMF creates, are really a very poor second to the US dollar. Finally, everybody else in the world wants to use and hold US dollars, whether it is central banks in the developing world or others. So we have today still a US dollar system. It's just not based on gold. It's not based on any fixed commodity. And that's as it should be, because money is anyway in the mind.
Thank you, Jayati, for that response. So I'm going to jump on to another question very quickly. So I know we discussed this a bit further towards the top, but I was wondering if either or both of you might be able to go in a bit more detail. So we know that the IMF and the World Bank play a uniquely harmful role in the world and the global financial system. But their roles, as you mentioned, Jayati, are actually quite necessary in terms of providing development financing, lender of last resort, and so on. So in like a bit more detail, what would the beginnings of some kind of alternative to that look like? Which is to say, what should we be fighting for, both in the short and the long term?
Do you want to take that, Bhumika?
I'd love for you to go first. Great.
Sorry, I was reading the other question, so I missed this one. Which one was this one?
Oh, yeah. No, basically, it's just, we just wanted to know, so in exchange for the IMF and the World Bank as they exist, what would be the preferred
Okay,
alternative to
and I
to
think
these
that also fits in with some of the other questions about what would be a more socialist thing and what's the possibilities for reform of the IMF and the World Bank. So
Yes.
as I said, we need these two functions. We need a function for global stabilization and lender of last resort. That's true of any banking financial system anywhere, and it's as true for an international one. And we need development finance more than ever before. We are facing the biggest threat humanity has ever faced in terms of the climate challenge. We're not spending anywhere near what is required. So we need global public investment. What we need are institutions that respond to those challenges. Okay, and therefore that means they have to be fundamentally restructured. Yes, of course, in terms of the voting rights, but most of all in terms of their ambition and their conditionalities. So the conditionalities that need to come about, for example, the World Bank should be giving many, many multiples of finance for climate, for health, for meeting the sustainable development goals, and so on, okay? The IMF should be much more available to address the existing debt problems of the developing world. We haven't really touched on that, but I noticed that there were several questions about that. Right now, most developing countries, not just a few, most are spending much more on debt servicing than they are on health. And this is going to get worse and worse. And we are looking at imminent debt crises of the Sri Lanka variety in many more countries, low and middle income countries, by the end of this year. So how do we address this? It's really only a multilateral institution that can do it. Okay, and it has to be very systematic in terms of having a set of rules for sovereign debt resolution, just like you have rules for debt inside the country, inside the US. You have rules for corporate debt, personal debt, community debt, municipality debt. Similarly, you need a system of rules that allows debt restructuring. Can you do that just like you did, Jubilee? I think there was a question about that. It's much worse and more complicated than that now. Jubilee was a sort of reduction of a forgiveness of public bilateral debt and a little bit of multilateral. Okay, so it was some government saying we are going to forgive the debt that we owe these highly indebted poor countries. That's about it. Today, about 70% of debt is held in private hands. It's held by private banks. It's held mostly in the bond market by all kinds of bondholders. For all you know, your parents have pension funds which are holding this debt. So it's really complicated now to do this debt forgiveness. Forgiveness is a different thing, or restructuring is the term everybody likes to use. It basically means you're reducing the amount of the debt. It's different from just rolling over the debt, which is what just happened during the pandemic, the moratorium. Okay, everyone said, oh, you don't have to pay now because it's a pandemic. We give you a year. It doesn't mean that you don't pay it. It just means you're pushing the can down the road. And in that period, the can has got larger because all that interest is being added on. So a debt rollover is postponing the problem and usually making it worse. Debt restructuring is what you have to do. Basically, you have to reduce it. And it's happened over and over again. It's happened in the US. It's happened to Germany in 1951, when all its creditors halved its existing debt. It's happened to so many countries. I mean, there's no debt system in the world that hasn't had periodic restructuring. But it's being denied to developing countries. So we have to have a system for doing that, which means we have to have an IMF that is flexible and responsive to all of this. How do we get there? How do we do this? So, there are more and more voices demanding this kind of change. I am actually part of a board set up by the UN Secretary General to look at effective multilateralism. And one of our areas of focus is international financial architecture. How do we change these institutions? How do we make them something which is relevant and useful for humanity in this current situation? So there are clear sort of, if you like, pathways for reform. The question is the political will. And the political will, the real problem, as usual, I mean, let me call it G7 for want of a better word. It's the US and the big European powers. And pretty much at the moment, they have shown that they are unresponsive to anything. It's not surprising. They don't want to give up power that they already have, but they're unresponsive to anything that serves the global public good and also their own people's good. If you look at what just happened in the WTO with the patents, it's exactly the same thing. They're promoting the interests of big pharma versus the rest of the world and their own people and taxpayers who are paying more for those drugs and vaccines and so on. Similarly, in the IMF, they are resisting change, not because it is the US versus other countries. It's big capital in the US and Europe versus everybody else. So really, I think it requires much more mobilization. It requires much more active in the North. I hate to say this, but that's where the action is. It has to change in the North because it will not change globally until governments in the North are forced to change. I did actually give I forget what it's called, but I had to present before the House Financial Services Committee that Bhumika was mentioning. And what was really fascinating to me was the extent of animosity of the Republican congressmen to the IMF. They see it as this terrible multilateral thing that is taking away the US power. Why should the US fund it, they say, not realizing that the US doesn't really fund it. And furthermore, that the US is the biggest gainer from the IMF and so on. But what we need to do, and I think what progressives in the US and Europe particularly need to do, is to force their governments to ask for the IMF reforms, which are frankly essential if you all want to be alive 20 years from now. Because we are heading for major global catastrophes unless we get this global public investment. We will not get it with the kinds of IMF and World Bank we have today. We have to change those institutions. It can be done, but it needs really lots of mobilization and pressure from below to make particularly G7 governments change.
Thanks a ton, Jayati, for that super interesting response. Bhumika, I remember you also spoke up a bit. Did you want to address that question? Or if not, I can just jump to the next one and bat it towards you.
I was actually thinking so many of the questions, of course, naturally are about what are the socialist solutions? What are the advocacy calls? What can we do? What is the way forward? And I think it's really important in these incredibly complex discussions on, let's face it, economic imperialism and the orchestration of financial hegemony, it's really important to focus on the ways forward. In fact, oftentimes I feel like we need to reverse the order in which we speak as well, and I'm guilty of not doing this enough, but to start with the ways forward and then address the challenges to those ways forward. So there are a number of key advocacy demands and calls that the global justice movements have been making for decades. Economic justice organizations, especially those rooted in the South, rooted in global South movements, they have been leading the way. They have come up with, they have articulated concrete ways forward. So, we're talking about progressive taxation on the wealthy and capital assets, addressing corporate tax evasion, universal social protection systems, strengthening trade union rights, ex ante and ex post participatory human rights impact assessments. And these human rights impact assessments to focus on disaggregation of data by gender and social groups, which is essential to ensuring economic equity, as well as transparent, participatory, and gender responsive budgeting. National dialogue with social movements, trade unions, civil society, feminist movements, creating more national, this was especially, there was great mobilization on this around the global financial crisis of 07-08. And there was also a big focus on this during the historic, protest movements against the World Bank and IMF in April 16th, 2000. And, in the late 90s and 2000s, there was that critical mass. There was a critical mass and a social movement. There was an aware public consciousness in the United States that has, over the last 2 decades, systematically and effectively disappeared in many ways, where you had tens of thousands of activists and campaigners show up in Washington, D.C., doing civil disobedience, blocking streets, being in solidarity with the global South, talking about economic imperialism and the role of the IMF and World Bank. And, I was an organizer as a senior in college back then in the April 16th, 2000 protests in Washington, D.C., and over 25,000 showed up on the streets, blockading, surrounding H Street and 18th Street in Washington, D.C. And I viscerally recall how the IMF staff were frightened. They were in shock. They felt that kind of visibility that they probably had not felt before, because they remain an arcane, technocratic. I mean, the key role of being a technocratic, bureaucratic institution is that you're shielded from the public gaze, you're shielded from accountability. The technical complexity of economics and macroeconomics keeps a lot of attention away. People don't go into the details of IMF loans. They felt they've always had a certain sort of immunity from the critical gaze of the public or from accountability, or even, people even understanding what they do. And this was an eye-opener, these protests, because it was student movements. It was student movements from United Students Against Sweatshops to teach-in groups, Public Citizens, Global Trade Watch, Global Exchange in the Bay Area Just Act. It was these grassroots movements in the United States doing massive teach-ins. We used to, get space in the All Souls Church, these universal denomination churches that would provide us with enormous amounts of space to do teach-ins among youth. Anywhere from high school all the way to college and even beyond. And trade unions were involved. Back then, SEIU was involved, Unite HERE was involved, Communication Workers of America were involved. And the strength of the trade unions really buttressed the movement. It was incredibly important to have that Teamsters and Turtles alliance that we saw in the Battle of Seattle protests against the WTO. So this social movement, this resistance movement is incredibly important, because once we cast light and make things visible, I mean, that's a sea change. That makes all the difference in the world, from the way how international institutions carry on, in opaque and away from the public gaze and without the accountability. So, this is extremely important. The sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, debt justice movements, there is a global, I wanted to really mention this, there's a global network of debt justice organizations. Jason Braganza, who was supposed to be with us, is from the African Network on Debt and Development. There's the European Network on Debt and Development. There's the Asia Pacific Movement on Debt and Development. And there is the Latin American Network on Debt and Development. So literally, they're called Latin Dad, Eurodad, Afrodad, and in Asia, APMDD. In the United States, it's called Jubilee USA. In the UK, it's the Jubilee Debt Coalition. Now they call themselves Debt Justice. And they work together in Germany, in the Caribbean, and the debt justice organizations work together in a coherent global movement, not just campaign, because there's several campaigns for different regions, including on debt and climate. But the core central advocacy call has been for the establishment of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism that can address unsustainable and illegitimate debt and provide systematic, timely, and fair restructuring of sovereign debt, including debt cancellation, in a process convening all creditors, bilateral, multilateral, and private. And this is a key demand. This is a key demand, and it goes way beyond debt swaps or debt for equity swaps or the reprofiling or the tinkering that the G20 has been doing of kicking the can down the road of just temporary suspensions of debt payments. That doesn't actually reduce debt. It doesn't actually create a fair burden sharing between creditors. So let's remember, in 2020, over 80 developing countries spent more repaying debt than they did on healthcare during a pandemic. In the midst of economic downturn, with revenues being slammed, they're still spending more of their precious, scarce public revenues to repay the richest creditors on the planet than on health and economic recovery and let's include the context of a vaccine apartheid where the global south wasn't accessing vaccines. So, and just to conclude that at the foundation of all of this, we need epistemic decolonization. We need epistemic dismantling of the neoclassical economic straitjacket, the hegemony of only one type of economic knowledge, propagating Tina, there is no alternative. We need to revive the plurality of economic and social theories, paradigms, analyses, and systems of knowledge. And this decolonizing economics and rethinking economics is, I know Jayati has been very much involved with these endeavors, as have many progressive economists, to go beyond, Keynesian economics, to also consider a plurality of heterodox, of South Asian political economic thought, of Latin American dependency theory, and the ideas of Samir Amin and Andre Gunder Frank and many others on structural dependency. And by reviving this plurality of economic thinking, that really goes to dismantling the very heart of what keeps these institutions in place, which is the straitjacket of thinking, of consciousness in only one form. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bhumika, for that response and really highlighting the integral role that ideas, ideology, and also social institutions play in reinforcing these broader economic orders. It's very insightful. So moving on, oh, by the way, just a bit of housekeeping, and also just since Jason is here, I was thinking that we might be able to end closer to 3:15 as opposed to the predicted 3:30 timeline. With that said, moving on to the next question we have, and also touching back again on the sort of dichotomy between global north and south. We understand that, of course, the global south is the one that's most detrimentally affected by these institutions like the World Bank and IMF, but the global neoliberal project that they enforce is also harmful to and exploitative of workers in the global north as well. So as we in the north seek to resist these institutions and show solidarity with comrades in the global south, how do we understand the material impacts on the northern working class? And in order to mobilize these types of northern movements that you mentioned, Bhumika, how would we really demonstrate the shared material interests that transcend borders? And that's addressed to either you, Bhumika, or to you, Jayati, whoever feels like chomping at the bit.
Okay, that's such a big question. But I want to emphasize that the way the IMF and World Bank and indeed the WTO are functioning today, it's not about this country versus that, although that's how it's presented and that's how the media shows it all the time. It is really about big capital versus everybody else. And that is as true of the World Bank and IMF as it is of the stuff that's going on in the WTO with intellectual property rights and trade rules and everything else. When you think about the loans that the IMF gives, it's not just the conditions that they do, that they impose, it's also who gains from those loans. Latin America is such a classic example. In Brazil, before Lula came to power the first time, he had to sign, all the presidential candidates had to sign an undertaking that they would accept the IMF's conditions. This is before he becomes president. And the IMF conditions were such that they got a loan of 42 billion. 40 billion of it went to pay 3 US banks. The other classic case is very recently, Argentina, President Macri, who was a big liberalizer, a big friend of global finance. And he went and opened up the capital account in Argentina. He did a deal with some of the holdout bondholders so that he could access global capital markets again. And so everybody loved him, The Economist, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal. And he opened up the capital account, allowed capital outflows, and then obviously ran up a big deficit and went to the IMF cap in hand. The IMF should not have given this huge loan, the largest loan in its history, $45.4 billion. But President Trump and Macri are old friends, and Trump leaned on the IMF. They gave this $45.4 billion loan, making no requirement for preventing capital outflows. Argentina lost in 1 year more than the amount that they had got in terms of the IMF loan. So it was completely wasted money, and then the new government is still picking up the pieces. So the only beneficiaries are big capital. big finance, big pharma, big tech, big data. These are the beneficiaries. We need to get that home to people. Those who are wrestling with debt concerns of their own in the US, they're fighting the same enemy as the ones who are wrestling with debt concerns in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, and Latin America. So I think one major part of this global solidarity, and the other one is the obvious one, the pandemic. I really did not see a huge movement within the US fighting the intellectual property restrictions, the patent laws that have prevented a widening. What's the result? You're back with endless waves of this disease. You're not going to get rid of it until you ensure everybody's vaccinated. If you cannot vaccinate everybody until you allow more production and dissemination of the knowledge, which means you have to get rid of those intellectual property rights. The US government and the European governments could get away with this obscene protection of big pharma because there wasn't enough public outcry about it in the US. So we're all the losers. Everybody in the US is as much of a loser. And I think that message needs to come home. That it's not just a general ethical thing of being nice to other people and being a do-gooder. It is about your own self-interest. It's even truer of climate change. So, I could go on about all of that. I won't. I just want to answer a few of the factual questions. Who funds the IMF? Interesting. It was originally just, money put by all the member states in accordance with their quota. So it began that way. Currently, it's funded entirely by the money it gets from its loans, believe it or not. It lends out and then it makes money like a money lender the same way. And it imposes this terrible system of surcharges, which is that if a country has to take a very large loan or if it cannot repay the loan in time, it imposes a surcharge. So the countries that are worst off have to pay additional amounts. And guess what? Those surcharges contribute to something like half of the IMF's current functioning operational costs. So it's really, this completely unfair, unjustified, illicit surcharge is keeping the IMF going. It doesn't need this, by the way. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of its total capital. And it can create more money, like the SDR that has just created, the special drawing rights of 650 billion. It can create more money. Just like the US can create money out of a hat, so can the IMF. If it doesn't do so, it's because the powerful interests that control it don't see an advantage in it for themselves. So that's the real problem. Do we reform the IMF or create a new institution? Darlings, we don't have time. It's too urgent. The problems are too desperate. It took decades and a world war to get everyone together to, in fact, think of creating even the IMF and the World Bank. We have to think of major reform of this in terms of changing the way they operate, because we have that framework, we have that structure, we have to mobilize it to meet our global challenges. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Final factual point on Ukraine. Interestingly, before the war, Ukraine was also as much of a sufferer from IMF conditionality. It really was bashed around big time and made to cut fiscal austerity, hollowed out the state and so on. So suddenly now, of course, Ukraine is everyone's darling, but before that, the IMF pretty much turned the screws on Ukraine the way it had done on so many other countries.
Thank you very much, Jayati, for all of those responses. Okay, so we're running up on time, but we have one more question that I think we might be able to squeeze in. Basically, many folks on the left, I believe, recently have found ourselves in this kind of awkward position of advocating sometimes in favor of action from the IMF or the World Bank as opposed to against it. For example, agitating for greater releases of special drawing rights or for relaxing the trade-related aspects of intellectual property and things like that. Now, SDRs are a very big issue, and our subcommittee actually had a full webinar on it, including with you, Jayati, as well, which anyone can find online if they're interested. But could you give a quick explanation just of what the special drawing rights are and why they're needed in this moment, and why we on the left should be, in this specific case, supportive of this IMF action instead of just, wanting to totally rearrange the house, so to speak?
Should I go? Bhumika, do you want to go first?
Yeah, Bhumika, if you want to go.
No, Please go first. I can add to you.
So, special drawing rights are a kind of liquidity which is currently composed of a basket of the major currencies. It's just a unit of account. And every country has an SDR account with the IMF. You can withdraw it, but that requires you to pay a rate of interest, which is really small. At the moment, I think it's 0.74%. It's the current rate of interest on the SDR. The SDR were first created way back in the 1970s, but then they were really not used very much. There was an expansion of about 236 billion in just after the global financial crisis. And then the next big one was last year, way too late and not enough, but still it was $650 billion worth, 500 billion SDRs. Now, the trouble is that they are allocated according to quota, which means that all these rich countries who don't need the money get 64% of it, right? US, Europe, Japan, no, they're never going to use this, but they end up getting 65% of the SDR. The developing countries that do need it get this tiny, tiny fraction, but even that is a huge deal for many of them. So the right wing in the US doesn't want SDR expansion because they don't want countries they don't like to get it. There was this whole fear that Iran will get it, Venezuela will get it, Afghanistan will get it. As it turns out, even that is not true because the US, through its veto power, has made sure that the IMF does not recognize the governments of Venezuela, Iran, or Afghanistan. So they cannot access their own money. So US is still controlling that. But despite that, even the countries that did get SDRs, it did make a huge difference, even though it was relatively small amount. And Ukraine, for example, was a major user of these SDRs to actually beef up its own government spending on social protection and health, which it turns out was essentially very needed. There is a very strong case for a regular allocation every year of, let's say, 650 billion. Why? Because that is the number that you can get through without having to go to Congress in the US. And as you can imagine, Congress is the big thing holding everything back, not just nationally, but globally. So 650 billion every year would mean that a whole bunch of countries will never use it. It will just lie there in their account. But at least the countries that need it will have access to resources that they can use. And of course, there's a very strong case to recycle it. If you're not going to use it, move it on to other funds, other global public investment funds. Again, that requires public pressure. And there's been none of that in any of the rich countries.
Thank you, Jayati.
I would just add to this the distribution challenge, the distribution issue that SDRs are allocated according to the quota, the voting rights. So what you have is the vast because of the rules, these inequitable rules governing SDR distribution. In August 2021, the IMF issued 650 billion. Out of the 650 billion, more than 400 billion of SDRs went to rich countries that don't actually need them. I mean, this is a really perverse scenario where the vast majority of the allocation went to rich countries that don't need them. And a very small remainder went to developing countries. And, even with the small remainder, even with the fraction that went to developing countries, there's reports that at least 99 low and middle income countries have used 104 billion SDRs since the August 2021 allocation. And many of these countries rushed to use some or all of their SDRs within weeks of the allocation, which goes to show just how urgent the need was. The degree to which foreign exchange reserves, out of which countries pay for imports in foreign exchange currency, had been depleted to such a dismal level where maybe only 1 week or even a few days of payments was still possible. So the need has been enormous. To put this into perspective, a group of civil society organizations, of which myself and Michael at CEPR are all part of, we put together an advocacy petition and letter address to the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors of the IMF. I shared the link, and we have a lot of support for this letter, and we have we've collectively formulated a set of rechanneling principles. The G7 has agreed or committed, has not implemented, but has committed to recycle 100 billion of their SDRs. As civil society have been pushing for donations rather than the recycling through the IMF. But many central banks, especially Germany, for instance, do not permit a direct donation. Some central banks have done a direct donation, including China, actually. So the rechanneling principles that have been laid out really demand that the way that SDRs are then recycled from rich countries to developing countries across the South maintain the original characteristics of SDRs, meaning two central original characteristics: coming at no cost and with no conditionality. When they're recycled through IMF loans, and indeed there is the creation of a very new IMF facility, a brand new IMF facility, a brand new IMF loan called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is supposed to address climate change related financing. When it comes through IMF loans, it will invariably and inevitably come with the fiscal consolidation, austerity, and tightening measures. So there's definitely a lot of advocacy on this. I think a key thing here is how effective would it be if US-based movements, if social movements, if the DSA were to also join forces with this advocacy and take to orient some of these calls to Congress, and specifically to the House Financial Services Committee, and spread the awareness and build the consensus and understanding of the importance of SDRs, and some of the calls that the global justice movements are making around this, because SDRs also have great potential, possible potential for example, for cancellation of debt. It can be used to pay off debt, or many other options that could really expand what is jargon termed as fiscal space, or just breathing space for countries that are in severe debt. Sri Lanka and many others, especially in Africa and Latin America, being examples of countries that really need that breathing space.
Thank you very much, Bhumika, for that response as well. Well, it looks like we're just about at time, the original time we were planning on. So I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists, Jayati and Bhumika, for all of your very helpful contributions. I hope that we can all take what we've learned to heart and use this information to ensure that socialist movements in the United States are truly internationalist and committed towards building a global economy that works for all of us. As a reminder, the recording of this event is going to be available on the IC's YouTube channel, and there will also be posting any of the prior sessions in this series that folks might have missed if they're interested. And hopefully people who joined this call will be able to join us for the next one that's coming up. The details will be announced shortly. And we're planning to focus on the global rules of trade involving both the WTO and NAFTA, as well as other institutions. So without further ado, thank everyone for attending. And once again, thank you, Jayati and Bhumika, for presenting. We really do appreciate you taking the time to clarify a lot of these very technocratic and archaic institutions.
Thank you.
Thank you all. This was great.